hit the record button on your computer there on the bottom.
Okay.
It says it's recording.
Okay, so you're all set. So now you can share your screen.
Okay. Great. Let's see. Now, are you able to see my screen?
Not yet. When you click the share screen, then it should say, what do you want to share? So you have to click the, there you go.
There you go.
You got it.
There we go.
All right.
All right. Very good. So George Patton, he only lived 60 years, but really it was the last 3 years of his life that were probably the most significant or the most famous, I think, in the eyes of the American public. And so I've subtitled this presentation, Legendary Leadership of the Local Variety. And the reason that for that subtitle is that I want to focus on 3 themes of Patton's life. So first of all, I wanted to kind of dive into his local roots and then the legend of his life and his accomplishments, which were pretty incredible. And then finally, I'll get into some of his leadership and his style and perhaps maybe some of the lessons that we could learn even from his leadership today. So part 1, the local roots for General Patton. So this photograph, I got this from the San Marino Historical Society. This was taken in 1926, and this is looking down the hill toward what would become Lacey Park. And you can't really see it on the picture, but the Patton home, if you've ever been to San Marino, Patton's home is on a street called Patton Court. The home would be over to the left off of the frame. So it's you can kind of see how open the area was. There, very few homes in the picture there. You really only see, a few roads there. But in the center of the screen, that's actually Lacey Park. So the story goes in 1854, Benjamin Wilson, who would become Los Angeles' first full-time mayor, bought 128 acres of land in the heart of what would become eventually the city of San Marino. And in 1884, he gave that property to his youngest daughter named Ruth and her new husband, who was an attorney, George Smith Patton II. And within a year, the Pattons had their first son, whom they named George, or they often called him Georgie. And Patton Sr. often referred to him as the boy. Here's a picture of the home as it looks today. In 1910, George Smith Patton built a 3-story, 8,000 square foot home with a wine cellar overlooking the lake, which cost at the time an exorbitant $20,000, which was, pretty significant. He called it Lake Vineyard since he planted vineyards and citrus trees. Here's a picture of the home from the Google satellite image. Today, it is a private residence at 1220 Patton Court and is not open to the public. George Patton's sister actually lived in the home until her death in 1971. And I was just kind of curious, and I wanted to see what the value of the home would be. And so I checked, and this was a few months ago. It was valued at $8.7 million with a mortgage payment of $37,600 per month. So the next part then, that's kind of the local aspect. And now I want to get into kind of the legend of who Patton was. And I picked this quote. If you've ever seen some Patton statues, there's one in Lacey Park in the city of San Marino, but you'll very often see this quote associated with General Patton. It says, "Let me not mourn for men who have died fighting, but rather let me be glad that such heroes have lived." And really this kind of, in my mind, exemplifies Patton's life, because even though he was deeply religious and he was adhered to the Christian faith, he also believed in reincarnation, and he expressed a deep conviction that he had actually been a soldier in several lifetimes past. So George Patton was born November 11th, 1885. And if you asked him when he was a kid, what do you want to do when you grow up? He would probably say, I want to be a soldier and I want to be a war hero. In fact, a lot of the heroes that Patton looked up to when he was a child were Roman generals, medieval knights, Napoleon Bonaparte, even soldiers from the Civil War. One, in fact, his name was John Singleton Mosby, whose nickname was the Gray Ghost. He was a Confederate cavalry commander who had survived the war, was still living, and very often would come to visit the Patton family at their home in San Marino. And Mosby was a cavalry commander, and many believe this is where George developed his love and interest in horseback riding. Patton attended Virginia Military Institute for a year, and then he transferred to West Point, where he graduated 46 out of 103 cadets in 1909. He was not a stellar student, but he was a very good athlete, and he was known for his determination and drive. Many believe that his poor academic performance was because he struggled with dyslexia. And as a teacher, I can relate to students who struggle with reading. I know how hard that can be. And even so, he didn't let that limit his success in life. The picture on the right is the Patton statue at West Point. And it was pointed out to me that the statue is actually facing away from the library, which some would indicate his lack of interest of going into that building. So in 1910, May 26, 1910, George married his sweetheart, Beatrice Eyre. And she was the daughter of a wealthy Boston businessman. His name was Frederick Eyre. He owned American Woolen Company. So she was quite wealthy. The Pattons were quite wealthy. And really, Patton did not have to go into the military. He had graduated from West Point at this time, but that was his calling. And I mean, he could have been a businessman. He could have gone into politics. He could have done a number of different things, but he chose the military. And Beatrice was willing to follow him in this endeavor. And the two had a mostly happy marriage, although there are a few interesting stories that I've read in doing my research. In 1912, George had competed in the Olympics in Stockholm, Sweden, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. But the Olympics had were finished, and he got permission from the army to stay in Europe and take fencing classes from the French in Paris. And so he and Beatrice were in Paris for a number of weeks. George finished the fencing classes, and they were just, Beatrice had spent the day packing up all of their possessions in containers and boxes and had them all sealed. And George comes running into the room with two new French swords that he had just purchased. And he demanded that Beatrice pack them in one of the crates, that she would, open it up and repack them. And at this point, she became very, very angry. It is said that she unsheathed one of the swords and started chasing George around the room with it, and then swearing and cursing at him in a way that probably would make her husband proud, until finally he gave in and said, I'm sorry, I'll pack them myself, which he did. And so the two were mostly happily married, although there were some rough spots. In between the wars, in between World War I and World War II, this is kind of where Patton sank into kind of a low point in his life. He started turning to alcohol, and he also engaged in an extramarital affair with a woman named Jean Gordon. She was a Boston socialite and Red Cross worker. She was 21 years old at the time and Patton's niece by marriage. And this affair nearly destroyed his marriage to Beatrice, but Patton was able to convey his remorse at the relationship, and Beatrice accepted it as authentic. And then during World War II, Beatrice was a very faithful supporter of George. In fact, she traveled around the country doing bond drives and helping to get more financing for the war effort for her husband. Beatrice died in 1953 in Massachusetts while horseback riding. And her dying wish was that she would be buried next to her husband, who had been buried in a cemetery in Europe. But the government said no because it was a military cemetery. And so, kind of true to Patton form, 3 years later, her children took her ashes over to Europe and spread her ashes over her husband's gravesite at that cemetery in Luxembourg. Now, I mentioned before that Patton was an athlete, an extraordinary athlete. And in 1912, he competed in the Summer Olympics in Stockholm, Sweden, representing the US Army, West Point. He competed in an event called the pentathlon, which consisted of horseback riding, swimming, fencing, running, and shooting, target shooting. And Patton used a 38 caliber pistol for the target shooting event, where most of his competitors used a 22 caliber pistol. So the 38 leaves a much larger hole in the target. And the judges scored his target shooting low because they claimed that he missed the target with one of his shots, to which Patton explained, no, I didn't miss. It was just 2 bullets that went through the same hole. The judges didn't quite see it that way, and he ended up finishing in 5th place. Although had he been able to convince the judges otherwise, he would have won the event. Patton was also an extraordinary innovator. He applied the lessons he learned from the French fencing school, and he used those to design a new saber for the United States cavalry. And he also designed a special uniform for tank crew members that ultimately was never adopted by the US Army. And this is a picture of it here on the screen. And I'm not sure, but I'm kind of wondering if maybe because it looks like the quarterback on the football team is also coming in to do the halftime show with a marching band. So
Yeah.
maybe that's why they nixed that. I'm not quite sure though. So Patton's career was launched at this point. He served with General John Pershing in the chase for Pancho Villa, the excursion into Mexico by the US Army in 1916. And in 1917, when the United States joined World War I, he served under Pershing's staff, and Pershing gave him the very special position of putting him as the head of the newly formed US Tank Corps in World War I. Now, tanks were just a new invention at the time, brand new to the war. A lot of times they would see these French tanks, these British tanks, and they would break down in combat, and they would have problems with supply and parts and so forth. So the kind of the higher ups in the military felt like the tank may not be the wave of the future, but Patton saw it differently. He felt that like this is going to be the new technology that's really going to drive the future of warfare. After World War I, Patton helped write a manual on tank operations where he saw the future use of tanks in combat. The US military doctrine was in direct contrast to this because they had placed emphasis on the use of infantry rather than armor. And the US Congress left the armored branch without funding, and development of an armored force was ultimately postponed. And then World War II began in September of 1939. And when Germany invaded Poland to start the war, one of the things that the military experts around the world realized was that the Germans were using tanks very effectively. And they had a special name for it. They called it Blitzkrieg, which just means lightning warfare. And so Patton realized that this was going to be significant, was going to be important, and he was really anxious to put this to use for the Americans. Patton was given command of a task force of about 33,000 soldiers. So he wasn't yet at that position where he was overall commander of an army, but for the invasion of North Africa, and it was called Operation Torch. And the first step was to defeat the Vichy French, who were allies with the Nazis in North Africa, and he defeated them pretty easily. And then he moved east to face the German Afrika Corps. And they were under the command of this fearsome leader by the name of Erwin Rommel, who is also known as the Desert Fox, who many believed was indefeatable, that you just could not beat this guy. An American army was soundly defeated at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, at which point General Eisenhower, who was the overall commander of American forces, fired the general, who had the name of Lloyd Friedenhall, and he replaced Patton and put Patton in Friedenhall's position and gave him command of the American forces in North Africa. And this is a quote from one of my sources on what Patton did to kind of change the tone of the military in North Africa. So this is from Zimmerman. He says, Patton wasted no time. On March 7th, his first day of command, the newly promoted lieutenant general ordered the mess closed at 7:30 a.m. That was just the start. A round of inspections commenced, Finding discipline lax, even non-existent, he imposed a sweeping range of shock tactics designed to transform them into a fighting force. Rigorous training regimens were imposed. Each time a soldier knotted his necktie, threaded his leggings, and buckled on his heavy steel helmet, he was forcibly reminded that the pre-Kasserine days had ended and that a tough new era had begun. So he whipped the American forces into fighting shape and got them into a place where they would be respected as an army. The next step would be the invasion of Sicily, and this would be called Operation Husky. At this point, Patton was put in charge of the 7th Army, and he was given kind of the command to cover the western flank of the island of Sicily. And really kind of the glory job was given to the British general, Bernard Montgomery. And Montgomery was supposed to get, all of the, the good assignments and the, kind of the role that would give him the most notoriety. And Patton replied to this when he found out that he was just going to be basically covering Monty's flank. He said, "This is what you get when your commander-in-chief, in this case Eisenhower, ceases to be an American and becomes an ally." So he started to see right away that politics was influencing military strategy, and he didn't like it because he was a man of action. He wanted to get things done, and he didn't like politics, sinking into the mix. So Patton's army landed in Sicily, and within 72 hours, they raced 100 miles. They got all the way up to the top of Sicily to the city of Palermo. And then from there, they traveled all the way across to the other side of the island to Messina and beat the British, who were supposed to go to Messina originally. And General Montgomery did not like that at all. But when I was reading through some of the sources, it's really kind of hard to find a lot of Patton's peers who speak highly of him. Some of the historians do, but when you look at the primary sources, some of his peers were not real fond of him. And so this is what General Bradley said about Patton. And General Bradley was, at this point, his right-hand man. He was under Patton, 7th Army. Bradley said, he, meaning Patton, traveled in an entourage of command cars. His own vehicle was decked with oversized stars in the insignia of his command. These exhibitions did not awe the troops as perhaps Patton believed. Instead, they offended the men as they trudged through the clouds of dust left in the wake of that procession. So, not everybody was in love with Patton. Although we'll talk about his leadership later on, and I'll let you guys make up, your mind in terms of how he did effectively as a leader. A few weeks later, Patton was visiting a field hospital in which he saw a young American soldier who appeared not to be injured. And he asked the soldier what was wrong, and the soldier said, "I just can't take it anymore." At which point Patton slapped the soldier. He pushed the soldier out of the field hospital. He even threatened to shoot the soldier for cowardice. 10 days later, the very same event transpired, but this time reporters were present, saw it, and reported it to the US command, General Eisenhower. At that point, Eisenhower wanted to fire Patton, but a guy by the name of Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War, who had also befriended Patton during World War I, stepped in and said, "No, we need Patton. He's too good of a commander." But at this point, Patton was relieved of his command, and Omar Bradley, who was underneath him, leapfrogged over Patton and was given command of the 1st U.S. Army in September of 1943, which would prepare for the invasion of Western Europe. So if you're interested in Patton's life, one of the things I found was I went to the Library of Congress, and I found the Patton papers, his diaries basically from 1910 to 1945. And just reading through these, it was very, very compelling. I just picked one to kind of show you kind of what it looked like. Some of them are handwritten and some of them are typed. The typed ones are a lot easier to read. But in this particular excerpt, Patton describes the importance of the use of tanks in warfare, and he provides some insight into the tactics, which includes using infantry to try to probe at the enemy weak spots and figuring out where the weak spots are in the line, and then using armor to come and smash through that line and exploit it. And this is what Patton says about that strategy. He said, "Such methods assure victory and reduce losses, but it takes fine leadership to ensure the execution. General Keyes provided perfect leadership and great drive. The praise should be his. So if you're interested, these are available online, and it's very fascinating. The one gap I noticed was with the slapping incident. There are no diary incidents, diary excerpts that occur around that incident of, when he slapped the soldiers. So we really can't get into his mind too much. We can only really speculate, but they're there if in case you're interested. So Patton was relieved of his command, and he was put in charge of what was called the 1st United States Army Group, which was basically just a made-up unit. It really wasn't an army. It was just pretend. But when the Germans learned about this, that Patton had been relieved of his command of the 3rd Army, one German officer said that Patton is the most feared general on all fronts. Why would they do this? They couldn't understand. But they knew that he was doing something, that he was training something. And so the London section of the military intelligence, the Allied military intelligence, was hoping that double agents who were in England at the time would send messages back to the Germans and let them know that Patton's force was actually going to be the main spearhead force of an attack in northern France at the Pas de Calais, which is much farther north of the Normandy beaches. And they used operations called Fortitude and Bodyguard, which were basically using props and buildings and dummy airplanes and dummy tanks and landing craft, even fake radio signals to go back and forth to try to make it look like it was a real unit. And Patton was even photographed visiting this unit, but you can see in the picture that it's just it's an inflatable tank. It isn't even a real tank. And so they got the Germans to believe. In fact, it was so effective, the German 15th Army waited nearly 2 months at the Pas de Calais region, waiting for Patton's army to land, which never came. Patton actually came ashore at the Normandy beaches at the end of June of 1944. So once the American army was able to gain a beachhead at Normandy, they started moving south and east. Patton was able to take an area known as Falaise, or the Falaise Gap, Paris, Metz, and then further east from there. But there was a conflict in goals between the Americans and the British Army, and that led to some delays. And because of these delays, over 210,000 German soldiers were allowed to escape and prepare to regroup and counterattack later on. And Patton predicted this is exactly what's going to happen. They're going to escape and they're going to come back and attack. And sure enough, that's what happened. And it's called the Battle of the Bulge, because the Germans, Hitler ordered what was called the Ardennes Offensive, over 400,000 infantry that were reconstructed along with 400 tanks to smash through the American lines and create a bulge in the American lines and try to push forward west all the way to Antwerp. Now, Patton realized that this is what the Germans were doing. And so, excuse me, he ordered his command staff to come up with 3 different contingency plans. And he was invited to a meeting in Verdun to meet with General Eisenhower and the Allied commanders. And when Eisenhower said, "General Patton, how quickly can you have your army ready to move?" Patton replied, "As soon as you're through with me here, sir." And Eisenhower didn't believe him. He said, "No way, I'll give you 3 days." And so as soon as Patton left the meeting, he called up his command staff and he gave a 2-word code phrase, "play ball." And that's all it took to get 3 divisions moving toward the city of Bastogne, to which they were able to get there in 1.5 days. So Patton actually wanted to go further to the east and try to, again, catch the Germans before they could retreat. But this time Bradley overruled him and said, no, just focus on the town of Bastogne. That's where the 101st Airborne had been encircled. They need our help. So that's where we need to go. And by December 26, 1944, Patton and his 3rd Army had hit the left wing of the German army and reached the surrounded 101st Airborne. If you've ever read any of Stephen Ambrose's books, or you've seen the movie Band of Brothers that tells the story of the 101st Airborne, they would probably say, we really didn't need Patton's help. We were doing fine ourselves, but the history books give Patton the credit. kind of an interesting side story to the Ardennes, to the Battle of the Bulge, is that the weather was really bad. And when Patton was preparing his army to roll out, they had no air support because the planes couldn't fly in the bad weather. So Patton ordered the chaplain of the Third Army to say a prayer for good weather. After the chaplain prayed, the skies cleared and the planes could start flying again, to which Patton awarded the chaplain of the Third Army a Bronze Star. I don't think that's happened before for saying a prayer. As we get into 1945, Patton crossed the Siegfried Line and entered the Saar region of Germany. And Patton had taken the town of Trier, and a few hours later, he got a message from headquarters to say, bypass Trier, it will take you 4 divisions, and you don't have 4 divisions to take the town, so just leave Trier alone. Patton had already taken the town at this point, so he sent a message back to headquarters saying, have taken Trier with 2 divisions, do you want me to give it back? So again, classic Patton. He reached all the way to outside of Prague, Czechoslovakia, and then he was ordered back to Pilsen. He was ordered to retreat. And if you were to ask Patton, Patton would say, hey, I just want to keep going. His goal was to try to keep the Russians out of Eastern Europe. And because he kind of saw in the future that the Russians were going to be a problem. This map shows the movement of Patton's Third Army across Europe. You can see here's Falaise. Here's the movement into Paris. This is the Battle of Metz, where he kind of got bogged down a little bit. This is where he made the quick left turn to get up to Bastogne so quickly, and then moving further east into Germany, Czechoslovakia, and ultimately Austria. And he did all of this in 281 days. So May 8th, 1945, that was the end of the war in Europe. Patton requested to be transferred to the Pacific, but his request was denied. This picture, I'm not sure if you can see the image there, but this is Patton in Los Angeles in June of 1945. And he's going to make 2 significant stops when he comes back to the Los Angeles area. Number one, he's going to visit the Church of Our Savior, the church he had grown up attending when he was a young boy in San Gabriel. And the second is going to be the Huntington Library. And I'm going to explain the significance of both of those here in just a minute. When Patton returned to Europe, he was given command of as governor of Bavaria, the region of Bavaria, and his mission was to help rebuild the countryside and conduct a process known as denazification. The problem is that over a few months, Patton had allowed many of the Nazi members to remain in political posts. And so when questioned about this, Patton compared them to Democrats and Republicans in America. And he stated that these men were, they really weren't loyal Nazi party members. They were just, they kind of had to choose a side, and they did. And they just, fell on the wrong side of history. But the media responded negatively, and Patton was roundly criticized by the media, as well as General Eisenhower. Eisenhower fired him again, put him in charge of being the historian of the Third Army and their events through World War II. So in December 8th, 1945, Patton went on a hunting trip with his chief of staff, General Hobart Gay. And returning from that trip, they were traveling at a low speed, about 30 miles an hour. And an oncoming army truck turned left and crashed into their command car. Patton was thrown into the ceiling and then thrown forward into the glass divider behind the driver's seat. Nobody else was injured in the accident, but Patton broke his neck. And he was paralyzed from the neck down. When he was taken to the hospital, he told General Gay, this is a hell of a way to die. Beatrice was called, and she flew to her husband's side. And when Beatrice visited Patton, his words to her were, I guess I wasn't good enough. And she took this to mean that Patton his desire was to die in battle as a general, as a war hero. And he didn't die in battle. And so this was disgraceful to him. Eventually, on December 21st, George succumbed to his injuries, and he was buried on December 24th at a cemetery outside of Luxembourg for US troops that were killed at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, there's also, I mean, there's a lot of criticisms that we can make about Patton, but one of the criticisms that really stand out is that he was a bigot and he was a racist. And this, I thought these statements were kind of interesting because, first of all, if he was anti-Semitic, he fought really hard to free a lot of the Jews from the Holocaust camps. In fact, his army moved across Europe the fastest. If it were up to the British, you know, it'd be 1946 before they got through Europe. So, you know, he was really trying to, you know, get the Germans out and you know, of course, rescue the Holocaust victims. He was also the first American general to integrate African-American units into his own tank companies. So, you know, to call him a racist and a bigot, his language probably portrayed that. But his actions really demonstrated something different. At any rate, at the end of the war, 2 American soldiers were given some documents by German informants, and these documents turned out to be the actual Nuremberg laws. These are basically 4 pieces of paper that legalized discrimination of the Jews, typed up it quickly in 1935, signed by Adolf Hitler. Now, these 2 soldiers brought these documents back to Patton, and Patton then took them with him back to the United States. And he brought the Nuremberg documents to the Huntington Museum in June of 1945, where he gave them to the Huntington in a secret ceremony. Now, the Huntington Museum held onto these documents all the way up until the year 2000, and really nobody knew about it. So there's a few questions. In the year 2000, they turned the documents over to the Skirball Cultural Center, a Jewish cultural center. But some questions come up, and the questions are, of course, number one, why did Patton take the documents with him? They could have been used in the Nuremberg trials to try Nazi war criminals, and they could have been used as pieces of evidence. At this point, Hitler is dead, but some of the high-ranking, you know, Nazi leaders that were affiliated with these laws could have been implicated. The second is, why did the Huntington Museum hold on to these documents for so long and not really say anything? So I can't really answer those questions. You know, open to a lot of speculation. The best would be to hear from, you know, experts, you know, at the Huntington to see, you know, what you know, how they would describe it and why they did what they did. Finally, if you're into conspiracy theories, there's also this conspiracy that perhaps Patton was not killed in an accident, but was actually it was actually the Russians who staged the accident, and then later on he you know, may have injected something into him or you know, caused his early demise. That's a conspiracy theory that's really not provable, but that's kind of floating around. So now we're at part 3, Patton's leadership. And I thought this was really interesting because Patton as a leader is a really complicated figure. He isn't black and white. He isn't like, oh, he's a real bad leader. He isn't like he's just a fabulous leader that everybody loves, but he's got a lot of characteristics that make him successful. According to a Fortune magazine survey a few years ago, only 7% of American CEOs believe their companies are building effective global leaders. And one of the problems is that they are having trouble enhancing the ability of their leaders to adapt to different situations and adjust their behavior. Well, this is something that Patton was classic. He was expert at that. And so if you just look at the results of what Patton did as a commander, if you were to compare him to a Fortune 500 leader of a, you know, CEO of a company, and just look at his accomplishments on paper, it's pretty impressive. So his operation ran for 281 days. He had over 400,000 personnel in his employment, with a payroll of over $241 million. He carried over 1.2 million long tons of supplies in 3.7 million vehicles. They built nearly 2,500 bridges spanning over 8.5 miles. They repaired over 2,200 miles of road with over 2,000 miles of railroad constructed. And they laid over 3,700 miles of cable and completing over nearly 14,000 calls on that cable daily. And ultimately, he liberated 12,000 cities, towns, and villages in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. Pretty impressive accomplishments there. And then finally, I like to break down the Patton speech. If you've seen the movie Patton, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a good movie. It's old, but it stars George C. Scott. But it starts off with this famous speech. And as seen in the movie, this was the speech that Patton actually delivered with several variations between March and June of 1944. And of course, it uses a lot of profanity, and that's classic Patton. But the message that he provides is classic leadership. And this is what General Paul Robinette of the 1st Armored Division said about Patton's speech. He said, Patton radiated action, glamour, determination, and hearty but reserved comradeship. He came with a Marsian speech and a song of hate, gross, vulgar, and profane, although touchingly beautiful and spiritual at times. So it was this blend, this mix of vulgarity and just this, horrible awfulness of what war is, mixed with this kind of this friendship and this bond that's forged in warfare. So there are two real big if you break the speech down, I have a copy of the speech at the end of my presentation. So if you're interested, I'll be happy to share it with you. But if you break it down into segments, there are really two big areas that he focuses on in his speech: ideals and identity. And if you think about, military commanders in the past who have given speeches, he begins by coming into the room. He's got this commanding presence. He's wearing his, polished helmet, polished boots. He's got all of his medals on his jacket, and he puts on what he calls his war face. But many generals in the past would talk about the glories of fighting and dying for a cause. But this is where Patton flips the script. And he starts off by saying, nobody, he used another person or another name, nobody ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other person die for his. And so when John Singleton Mosby, that Confederate cavalry commander, came to visit him when he was a young boy, he talked about dying in war. And this was what Mosby said. He said that it is a classical maxim that is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. But whoever has seen the horrors of a battlefield feels that it is far sweeter to live for it. So maybe this is where Patton got this idea, and he kind of flipped the script on the notion of dying for your country. The next phrase, all real Americans love the sting of battle. So Patton here kind of establishes who we are as Americans, who they were as a part of the Third Army, and who each soldier is as a part of a team. And this probably is what gets Patton into trouble in Sicily, because his belief that no one would shirk from their duties in battle, and those men who appeared not to be injured did not fit with his view of what it meant to be a warrior. And then finally, Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. So notice Patton's reference here in criticism of losers. Perhaps this language may sound maybe similar to another colorful character of more recent political vintage. Who knows? Maybe Patton has been reincarnated after all. This is a stained glass window at the Church of Our Savior. And commemorating the service of General Patton. If you notice, what's interesting is there's actually a Nazi swastika and General Patton on his tank. You don't see those too often in church stained glass windows. There's also a memorial statue of Patton on the church grounds as well. And then finally, just down the hill from his family home at Lacey Park in San Marino, this monument stands commemorating the life and career of the most famous San Marino resident, George Smith Patton Jr. There are a number of Patton museums if you're interested in visiting. One is in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Another at the Chiriaco Summit out here in California on Highway 10. I visited that one. It's very interesting. Great tanks, a lot of great information on display. And there's a third one at Edelberg, Luxembourg, that is a memorial on basically the Battle of the Bulge. And Patton's tombstone is at a cemetery just outside of this city in Luxembourg. And finally, I'm not sure if any of you are veterans, but to those of you who are veterans who have served, also first responders, I'd like to say a special thank you to all the Rotary Club members who have served in our armed forces and first responders. Thank you for your service. We all owe you a debt of gratitude to stand in the gap and defend our nation and its ideals. This is a copy of the speech. If you're interested, I can send you my presentation and you can read the speech in its entirety. It includes all the profanity. And then this is the bibliography of the sources that I've used. And so that's all I have on Patton. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer, or try to anyway. I'm not an expert, but I certainly enjoy learning about this very interesting man.
Very good.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen.
You're
Thank
very welcome. You're very welcome.
Stephen, what made you so interested in General Patton to begin with? Why did you study up on him so much?
Well, I think it was, well, first of all, I'm a history teacher. And when I taught US history, World War II was like, 2 weeks out of the year. I could have spent 2 months talking about World War II. I really loved, when I was studying history, I really loved books on World War II. And Patton was just one of these real interesting figures because, like I said, it wasn't like he was this real fabulous guy that people just loved and looked up to, although a lot of people spoke highly of him. But he wasn't this scoundrel either that some people try to portray him. He was this real complicated mix of a person. And so that, to me, that really interested me. And then, of course, when Mr. Payne at San Marino Rotary Club said, "Hey, you want to talk about Patton?" I said, "Sure, yeah, it sounds great."
Yeah.
Say, Steve, you referred to the movie, Patton, and from the information you've highlighted with us this morning, it sounds like that movie was pretty much kind of on target, portraying Patton, all the different facets of General Patton's career and his personality.
Yeah, that's what I've read, is that they really got it right with the movie. They really tried to portray it accurately. And some of those scenes where, in North Africa, where the 3 German fighter planes strafe his headquarters, that actually happened.
Yeah.
A lot of those scenes, they were real scenes. In the movie, I think he's reading a book by General Rommel, and it's called Tank Battles or Tank Tactics. And the title of the book was a little bit different. It's called Infantry Tactics or something. So it was a little bit different title, but for the most part, they really, really did a good job of doing their research on Patton.
Stephen, did Patton's wife stay in California, or upon his death, did she move back to family in Massachusetts?
Yeah, she moved back to Massachusetts. She died in horseback riding in Massachusetts, so she moved back to her family.
You said something about there's a conspiracy theory that the Russians were involved in Patton's death. How could that happen? Weren't the two armies were I thought they were, I guess I assumed that they were somewhat separated, that they weren't they didn't commingle too much. There's the language barriers, there's the cultural barriers, and there's also the military directions of the two great armies. How did that happen?
Well, yeah, that's, and that's something that, when I was doing some research on that, those are some of the details that they kind of leave out. It's not unusual for an enemy to impersonate Americans. The Germans did that in the Battle of the Bulge. They had a whole unit, a military police unit that were trained to speak English and misdirected American forces away from the battle. So it's not uncommon for an enemy to try to do that. Patton at this point was very, very critical of the Russians. In fact, he was forced to stop at the Elbe River, but he wanted to keep going. In fact, he said, "I can take Berlin." He told Eisenhower, "I can get you Berlin." And Eisenhower said, "No, we'll let the Germans handle that." And Patton realized that if the Russians take Berlin, that means they're going to have control over Eastern Germany. and it's going to become a communist state. And sure enough, that's what happened. And he foresaw that the Russians, the Soviets, are going to be the next great adversary in the Cold War.
Mhm. Okay.
Stephen, I just had a question. If General Patton was alive today and leading and seeing the challenges that we face, what assumptions can you make? How would he handle it internally and externally?
Well, it's funny that you asked that. That's a great question. And it's anyone's guess, but, and please forgive me. I don't want to, inject politics into this, but he reminds me a lot of Donald Trump in a lot of ways, and that he's kind of misunderstood and kind of, he has a lot of good ideas, but then he gets a lot of criticism as well. And so I think, if he were alive today, I think he would be really, really discouraged with kind of, where we're headed, especially in terms of, our role in the world. I think, the great adversaries that, we realized are going to be a problem, China, Iran, Russia. I think he would see that kind of the handling of them, currently, that we may not necessarily be doing the right thing, but who knows, he probably would have gotten fired. So who knows?
Thank you.
Sure.
He certainly would have been impeached once or twice.
Right. At least.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
I'm a little jealous of your students. I'm sure you ran some very interesting classes.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind of you. It's really a passion for me. I love learning. I love teaching, and I love to communicate what I learn. So thank you so much for having me with you this morning. I really like your club. I like the free-spirited nature of your club. I think it's you've got a great group. So thank you so much for having me this morning.
Steve, are you a Covina native, or how'd you end up in Covina?
No, actually, my wife and I, we grew up in Nebraska. We're actually high school sweethearts. We got married after college. And after we both went to University of Nebraska, there really weren't a whole lot of jobs in the late 80s in Nebraska in our fields. And so she came out here to actually on vacation to stay with her aunt and uncle. And she ended up getting like 3 job offers. And she said, hey, there's a lot of jobs out here. So we got married, we moved out here, and we have been living out here since 1987. We moved to Covina in 2001. So we've been here about 19 years. We really like Covina. It's really a great community. So yeah, we've been here almost 2 decades.
You're always welcome to come to a meeting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, you guys.
Say, Steve, where did you grow up in Nebraska? I'm from Nebraska also.
Oh, you are? Okay. We grew up in Grand Island.
Okay, I grew up on the edge of Omaha.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
So did you go to college in Nebraska?
I went to the University of Nebraska at Omaha, which back then was Omaha University for a year, and then I came out to California. And like you and your wife, I was in California 24 hours and I had a job.
Yeah.
Working at Sizzler, but I was head boiler cook at Sizzler. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, there
Yeah.
was a lot of opportunity back in those days.
Oh yeah.
So when did you come to Covina? I'm sorry.
2001.
2001.
Yeah.
Oh, we'd certainly like to have you stop by anytime you feel like you need a fix of rotary discs in the morning.
All right. Well, thank you. I had a very enjoyable time, and it was great to get to know some of you and talk with you. So you guys are great. I really like the spirit of your group.
Yeah, as I communicated to you earlier, with the Zoom meetings that we're doing, our membership's down to a fraction of what we normally do, and unfortunately, because of Zoom, we can't do a lot of the craziness that we've made a part of our meetings normally. But we usually go kind of crazy, and we're sort of the more irreverent Rotary group in town, I guess I'd say, you know. There's a noon club, but they're a little bit more structured, a little more classic Rotary, I guess you'd say. But we like to sort of play around with it and have a good time and do good in the community.
That's great. That's great. That's a great combination. I love it.
Well, feel free to join us.
Thank you.
Don't
Thank you
use
very
the
much.
word different.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.